The road twisted endlessly through the woods, the headlights of the SUV cutting two pale lines into the dusk. 5 friends had been driving for hours, the forest closing in around them like dark ribs pressing against the sky. Jason, sitting in the back seat, pressed his forehead against the window and muttered that the place was in the middle of nowhere. Emma, always the optimist, smiled and said that was the point. No noise, no people, just the wilderness. Chris, riding up front, laughed that they would end up eating squirrels once they ran out of beer. And Lily, the driver, only shook her head, reminding them that there was a small town near the forest where they could stock up before heading to the campsite. By the time they reached the town, the sun had already begun to sink, staining the buildings with a dull, rusty glow. The streets were strangely empty, and those few locals who lingered outside the small general store watched the newcomers with uneasy stares. The friends stepped out of the car, stretching their legs, but the silence of the place pressed on them. An old man shuffled closer, his back bent, his face pale, his cloudy eyes fixed on the group. His voice rasped like dry paper when he asked whether they were heading into the silent forest. Emma admitted they were only camping for the weekend. The old man's gaze did not waver. He told them the forest did not forgive those who listened too closely. Jason laughed, brushing it off as nonsense, but the old man gave no explanation. He only shook his head and disappeared into an alley, leaving behind a chill heavier than his words. Inside the store, the unease only grew. The clerk spoke little, ringing up their supplies in silence. On a bulletin board near the counter, yellowed newspaper clippings hung in crooked lines. The headlines, though faded, were still legible. Search called off for missing hikers. Family vanishes without a trace. Emma lingered in front of them, transfixed, until Lily tugged her arm and urged her to leave. The group loaded their supplies into the SUV and drove on, the road narrowing the deeper they went. Soon the pavement ended, replaced by a dirt trail that led into the looming wall of trees. They parked at the edge, slung their backpacks over their shoulders, and stood in silence before the threshold of the forest. No one spoke, no birds sang, no insect stirred. The woods seemed to be holding its breath. Chris, forcing a grin, muttered a welcome to paradise, and with that, they stepped into the silent forest. The deeper they walked, the more the forest seemed to swallow them whole. At first, the path was clear enough, winding between towering pines, but soon it narrowed and twisted, choked by roots and fallen branches. The air grew colder, heavier, as though the sunlight itself struggled to reach the ground. It wasn't long before Jason noticed it. He stopped, glancing around with a puzzled frown. "Do you guys hear that?" he asked. The others paused. Emma tilted her head, listening. "Hear what?" "That's just it," Jason whispered. "There's nothing. No birds, no crickets, no wind. It's dead quiet." They stood there for a long moment, the silence pressing against their ears like a physical weight. Lily tried to brush it off, saying that maybe the wildlife had moved deeper into the woods for the season, but her voice sounded too forced, too thin. No one truly believed her. By the time night fell, the unease had settled in all of them. They pitched their tents in a small clearing, lit a fire, and tried to laugh, tried to push the tension aside. Chris told a few bad jokes, and Emma cracked open a beer, but the forest seemed to lean in around them, listening. Every snap of a twig in the fire made them jump. Every shadow beyond the circle of light felt alive. It wasn't near midnight when the first whisper came. Emma had been dozing lightly when she opened her eyes. At first, she thought it was part of a dream, but then she heard it again, drifting just beyond the firelight. A soft, broken murmur, almost like someone calling her name. She sat up, her skin prickling, and stared into the dark trees. "Did you hear that?" she asked in a low voice. Lily stirred in her sleeping bag. "Hear what?" "There," Emma whispered, pointing toward the black line of trees. "Somebody's out there." Jason laughed nervously. "Probably just the wind." But there was no wind. The air was still, the fire burning steadily. And then they all heard it, a hushed voice, threading through the silence, as though someone were standing just out of sight. The friends froze, staring into the darkness, their faces pale in the firelight. No one moved. No one dared to breathe. And then, as suddenly as it had come, the whisper stopped. The forest returned to silence, heavier than before. Morning brought no relief. The fire had burned down to cold ash, and the group awoke unrested, their nerves raw from the night before. Nobody spoke of the whisper, as though naming it would make it real. Instead, they packed their things in silence and pushed deeper into the woods, following what little trail remained. The deeper they went, the stranger the forest became. The trees grew closer together, their trunks twisted and scarred, the canopy above so thick it blotted out most of the light. At times, Emma swore the path itself was shifting, curving back in on itself, leading them in circles. Jason joked half-heartedly about needing breadcrumbs like in fairy tales, but no one laughed. By late afternoon, the unease had sharpened into fear. The silence weighed heavier than ever, broken only by the crunch of their boots on dead leaves. And then came the sound that didn't belong. "Wait," Chris said, suddenly, lifting his hand. His face had gone pale. "Did you hear that?" At first, there was nothing. Then, faint, almost hidden beneath the silence, came the sound of someone calling, a voice, low and urgent, drifting through the trees. "Jason." The group turned. Jason stood frozen, eyes wide, his mouth slightly open. "That's my sister," he whispered. "I swear to God, that's her voice." "Jason, no," Lily said quickly. "Your sister's not here, it's just—" But Jason was already moving, shoving past them, crashing through the undergrowth toward the sound. "Jason, stop!" Emma shouted, chasing after him. But the forest seemed to close around them, swallowing the noise, smothering the light. Within seconds, his footsteps faded, then disappeared entirely. They searched. For hours, they searched. His name echoed through the woods, growing weaker with each call, until finally they had to admit it. Jason was gone. When they stumbled back into the clearing, exhausted and shaken, something else awaited them. On the trunk of a tree near their tents, carved deep into the bark, was a symbol none of them recognized. A jagged spiral, twisting inward like an open wound. The group stared at it in silence, hearts pounding, too afraid to speak the thought forming in all their minds. They were not alone in this forest. That night, the forest pressed closer than ever. The fire seemed smaller, its light swallowed by the endless wall of trees. None of them spoke much. Every crack of the burning wood made them flinch, and every shadow beyond the flames felt like it was watching. Emma was the first to hear it again, a voice, faint and trembling, drifting through the silence. This time, it was not Jason's name, but her own. "Emma." She froze, her chest tightening. It wasn't just a whisper. It was her mother's voice, gentle and familiar. Her mother, who had been dead for 3 years. She pressed her hands against her ears and shook her head, whispering to herself that it wasn't real. But still the voice came, coaxing, pleading, pulling her toward the dark. Chris noticed her trembling and grabbed her arm. "Don't listen. It's not her." Before Emma could respond, Lily let out a sharp cry. She pointed into the trees. "I saw someone, right there, moving between the trunks." They all turned, straining their eyes. For a moment, there was nothing. And then, clear as day, came another voice. This one meant for Chris. a deep, familiar tone, calling his name the way his father once had. Chris's face drained of color. His father had died in an accident years ago. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "That's impossible." The voices grew bolder as the night stretched on. Each friend heard a different call, each one as personal and convincing as the last. Emma's mother, Chris's father. Lily swore she heard her younger brother crying. The forest seemed to know them, to dig into their grief and fears, using the voices of those they had lost. The group argued, panic rising. Emma insisted they had to leave immediately. Lily said it was too dark and they'd only get lost. Chris clenched his fists, staring into the trees, torn between disbelief and desperate hope. And then, without warning, one of them broke. Mark, quiet until now, stood suddenly and began walking into the forest. His eyes were unfocused, his expression calm, almost serene, as if in a trance. "Mark, stop!" Emma screamed. But he didn't turn. He moved steadily into the shadows, the trees swallowing him up. They scrambled after him, their flashlights bouncing wildly across the trunks, but the forest twisted and warped around them. Within moments, Mark was gone. No footsteps, no trace. All that remained was silence. When they stumbled back to camp, trembling and broken, Emma realized the truth that none of them wanted to admit. The forest wasn't just watching them, it was learning them. By the following evening, only 3 of them remained. Jason and Mark had vanished into the forest, swallowed without a trace. The group sat huddled in a ruined clearing, too exhausted to argue, too terrified to sleep. The air was colder now, carrying a dampness that clung to their skin. Even the fire seemed weaker, as if the forest itself was draining the heat from it. They found the campsite just before dusk, a half-burned hunting shack deep among the pines. The structure leaned sideways, its roof caved in, the ground around it littered with rusted traps and broken glass. It looked abandoned for decades, yet as they pushed inside, they found something that hadn't been touched by time. On a rotting wooden table lay a leather-bound journal. Its pages were warped with age, the ink smeared, but the words were still readable. Chris flipped through, his hands trembling, and began to read aloud. "The forest is not empty," the journal said. "It listens. It learns your voice. At first, it whispers with the tongues of the dead. Then, it takes more. The men I came here with are gone. I hear them calling, but I know better. It isn't them, it's the forest, and it is hungry." The final page ended abruptly, the writing scrawled as if in panic. "If you hear your own name, do not answer." Emma's face had gone pale. Lily slammed the book shut, her eyes darting to the black window frame, beyond which the forest loomed. That night they tried to stay awake, but the whispers came anyway. Softer, closer, more insistent. Chris heard his father again, begging him to come home. Emma's mother wept in the darkness, calling her daughter's name with such aching familiarity that Emma nearly broke down. And then Lily froze. A new voice had joined the chorus. It was her little brother. His voice was small, trembling, filled with fear. "Lily, please, I'm lost. I need you." Tears welled in her eyes as she rose to her feet. Emma and Chris grabbed her arms, pleading with her not to listen, not to follow, but Lily's face was streaked with anguish.
"You don't understand. He needs me." And before they could stop her, she wrenched free and ran into the darkness. Her cries faded quickly, swallowed by the endless silence of the forest. Now, only two remained.
By dawn, only Emma and Chris were left. They sat in the ruins of the hunting shack, hollow-eyed, clinging to the fading fire as though it were the last fragile thread tethering them to life. Neither spoke much anymore. Words felt dangerous, as if the forest was listening to every sound, every breath, waiting for a weakness. When the first light broke through the canopy, Emma stood. "We have to go," she whispered. Her voice was raw, cracked from fear and sleeplessness. "If we stay, it'll take us too." Chris nodded, though his eyes betrayed the weight of hopelessness. They packed what little they had left and stumbled into the trees. The journal's warning rang in their minds with every step. "If you hear your own name, do not answer." The forest seemed endless now, its paths twisting into loops. No matter which direction they chose, the landmarks repeated. The same crooked oak, the same moss-covered boulder. Hours passed, but they never seemed closer to leaving. The silence gnawed at them, deafening in its weight. Then came the voices, soft at first, then louder. Jason's voice, Mark's, Lily's, familiar, desperate, calling for help. The missing friends begged them to follow, their cries echoing through the trees. Emma bit her lip until it bled, fighting the urge to respond. Chris, however, faltered. He froze, eyes wide, staring into the shadows. "That's my dad. He's close. I can hear him." Emma grabbed his arm, begging him not to listen, but the voice grew louder, warmer, closer, filling the forest with the sound of a father's love. Chris tore himself free, tears in his eyes. "I can't leave him again," he said, and before Emma could stop him, he stepped into the shadows and was gone. The silence that followed was absolute. Emma stood alone, trembling, her breath ragged in the cold air. She turned in circles, searching for a path, any path, until she stumbled into a clearing. Her heart leapt as she recognized it, the same clearing where they had camped on their first night. Their fire pit lay in the center, charred and cold, surrounded by the outlines of tents that were no longer there. It was as if she had never left. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed onto the damp ground. The forest loomed around her, silent, endless, patient. Somewhere in the distance, a new whisper stirred, low, steady, unmistakably her own voice, calling her name. She clutched her ears, shaking, refusing to listen, but the whisper grew louder, closer, curling inside her skull. And then, at last, there was only silence.